The top 5 greatest fighters of every single division. That's right. We're ranking these fighters 1 through 5 per weight class. I'm choosing 5 based on strength of competition and ratio of wins to losses. So we're not really using any bias, okay? We're not going to be doing the usual, well, he's obviously first and he's obviously second because, you know, he's the most famous guy and the second guy's the second most famous. No, we're not doing this. This ain't based on fame, okay? This is based on what you've done in the octagon, how dominant you've been, how many losses you have, who have you lost to, all right? How great are the fighters that you've beat? How great are they? Did they go on to do great things, or was it just kind of a regular-ass, meaningless title win? We'll see. All right, but no nostalgia bias, no recency bias. This is just based on resume, and I've really given this some thought. I've spent a lot of time making this list, and we are going to be starting with the flyweight division. Starting with the flyweight division, the first pick, it may shock you, it's Demetrious Johnson. All right, I know this might be a controversial pick. Obviously, I'm kidding. Demetrious Johnson is still the flyweight GOAT. Now, I know I mentioned that strength of competition is going to be very important for this list. And Demetrious Johnson's strength of competition wasn't that crazy, but it was good enough if you pair it with his dominance and if you also pair it with the quantity of wins and the ratio of wins to losses. He doesn't have a lot of losses. A couple of the losses that he has, he didn't have until he was an older fighter. He's got wins over Henry Cejudo, Joseph Benavidez, Adriano Moraes, and a ton of quantity. And one of his losses to Henry Cejudo, I mean, to be fair, it was an incredibly close fight, so it wasn't a bad loss. But yeah, Demetrious Johnson is still the flyweight GOAT. Now, the second best flyweight of all time, that is the one that people are going to disagree with, but I've given it some thought, and it's not Henry Cejudo. It's Deiveson Figueiredo. Not only has he beat the current sitting champion, Alexandre Pantoja, he beat him in 2019, which was not that long ago. I mean, Pantoja was still really good back then. That win has aged incredibly well, and Pantoja has a really good resume right now. He's also beat Brandon Moreno. Fair enough, he's lost to Brandon Moreno, but he's beat him. And Brandon Moreno is one of the best flyweights to ever do it as well. He's beaten Joseph Benavidez twice. Okay, he was a little bit of an older fighter, but he's also dog-walked him. And he's just blasted through some of the other good ranked flyweights. So wins over Pantoja, win over Brandon Moreno, 2 wins over Joseph Benavidez, wins over people like Alex Perez. I mean, this guy was a dominant champion. He has tons of wins, and he's only got, like, what, 2 losses in his entire flyweight career? So, again, I'm not looking at Figueiredo's recent wins at Bantamweight. This is just flyweight, which is why I don't even have Henry Cejudo at the number 3 spot. It's not a hot take. I'm not trying to be different with this take. Henry Cejudo has lost to Joseph Benavidez, and Henry Cejudo, 2 of his greatest wins were up a weight class. So we're just looking at flyweight. I have Pantoja at 3. If you were to ask me a year ago, I would have said Henry Cejudo's at 3. But I think that with his most recent couple of wins, one of them being over Brandon Royval, who he beat for a second time, I think that he's at the 3 spot. I think he's finally earned it. He's done enough. This guy has beaten Brandon Moreno 2 times. 2 times he's beaten Brandon Moreno. He's beaten Brandon Royval 2 times. He's beaten Manel Kape, who's a really solid fighter. And he's beaten Steve Ercik. Now, to be fair, I actually think Steve Ercik beat him. That's why I have question marks there. But it was a very close fight. So it's not like, listen, I honestly think it was a loss, to be honest. I think I picked him to win. I was happy that I got my pick right on paper. But I actually think Ercik beat him, so I don't even know if I want to count that. But just in general, aside from that fight, he's got so many wins. I mean, he's defended his belt quite a bit too. And, I mean, 3 wins over Brandon Moreno in total, 2 wins in the UFC that actually count. One of them was an exhibition match. This guy has an insanely good resume, okay? So I do have Alexandre Pantoja at the 3 spot. He's also got wins over Perez, just like Figueiredo. And I got Henry Cejudo at the 4 spot. So, of course, you're going to look at the win over TJ Dillashaw. That's phenomenal. You're going to look at the win over Demetrious Johnson. That's phenomenal. It is. Okay? And the Sergio Pettis win. Outside of that, there's really not a whole lot for Henry Cejudo. And when I say not a whole lot, I mean, we're just talking based on quantity. Cejudo only really had like 8 wins in his flyweight career. Now, of course, 4 all time, people are going to be, I swear people are going to say I'm disrespecting Henry Cejudo. I'm disrespecting him because he's not at 3 or 2. This ain't about bias. I'm just saying I think Pantoja's passed him up. I think Figgy's passed him up. All right. Cejudo lost to Joseph Benavidez. He never got that one back. Cejudo has a couple of losses, not only to Demetrius Johnson, but he's got other losses at flyweight. And I just think that Pantoja's passed him. I think Pantoja's done more. So I have Cejudo at 4, still really solid. He became a champ, a win over Demetrius Johnson, which was incredible. Honestly, one of those fights that could have gone either way, but we'll give him credit. That was an incredible win. I just don't know if that in and of itself is enough. A win over TJ Dillashaw is great. That is phenomenal. But I have him at number 4. And I do not think it's disrespectful to have someone at 4 when you're talking about the greatest flyweights ever. How many flyweights have fought in MMA? You're in the top 5. That's amazing. Okay, let's get on to the next one. Brandon Moreno is at the number 5 spot. I think Brandon Moreno, I think he's definitely earned a top 5 spot. It's either him or Benavidez, but I have Brandon Moreno here with wins over Royval. He also lost to Royval, of course. 2 wins over Figueiredo, which is incredible. A win over Kai Kara France. So Brandon Royval has done a lot. It's just that he's lost recently. He's got a bunch of L's too. And, you know, I think that he's starting to maybe slip a little bit. But if he wins a couple more fights, if he wins a couple in a row, then I think that we're going to have to bump him up as well. I mean, this is a very close race. I think that if Pantoja wins one more time, I think he goes above Figgy. And I think if Moreno wins a couple more, he goes above Cejudo. Let's get on to the next weight class. This is my top 5 for flyweight. The next weight class is going to be Bantamweight. Okay? Now you're looking at this. You're looking at this list. Okay? Why is it already out there right in front of you? Well, I'll explain. I don't know who the Bantamweight GOAT is. It's not so obvious that it's Dominick Cruz. It isn't. He's got to win over Demetrius Johnson. But the thing is, I can't give Dominick Cruz the same amount of credit I would give to, let's say, Adesanya for beating Alex Pereira in his prime. Because when we talk about a win over Demetrius Johnson, the Demetrius Johnson that Dominick Cruz fought was basically like the Max Holloway that Conor McGregor fought. It was like a tadpole version, very young in their career. Now, the win aged well, and that's why you still have to have Dominick Cruz in the conversation for being the Bantamweight GOAT. You've also got a win over TJ Dillashaw. Great win. You've got wins over Benavidez, okay? Joseph Benavidez and Uriah Faber. The thing is, though, when you start comparing these wins to some of these other fighters, I just don't think they stack up. Again, that is taking into account the version of Demetrius Johnson that Dominick Cruz fought. Okay, TJ Dillashaw, people are going to freak out about that. TJ Dillashaw's resume is overrated. Okay, that doesn't mean TJ Dillashaw is not one of the greatest bantamweights ever. He is. Overrated just means I think people overrate it. I think they rate it higher than it actually should be. And what I mean is TJ Dillashaw is constantly talked about as one of the best bantamweights of all time. Okay? And he is. But I don't think he's anywhere near the 1 spot. And that is part due to the fact that 2 of his most famous wins, they're not his best wins, but 2 of his most famous wins when he was at his peak popularity-wise were over Cody Garbrandt, who has done nothing but lose to every single decent fighter he's fought since, and has only beat cans since. Cody Garbrandt, the wins that TJ has over him have not aged well. Cody Garbrandt is probably the worst, based on resume, champion in lighter weight classes history in the UFC. He's done absolutely nothing outside of beat Dominick Cruz. I don't really look at those wins as that special. So right off the bat, beating Cody Garbrandt, that ain't that great. Renan Barão, those wins are awesome. Those wins are good. But other fighters have also beat Renan Barão. Okay, those are probably TJ's best wins. The other win is over who? A Sun Tzu? I mean, when Assunção was in his prime, he was good, but like, we're really just looking at Renan Barão wins, Rafael Assunção. I know that he had a close fight with Dominic Cruz, but my point is, I don't think that the Cody Garbrandt fights should really even be factored that heavily, okay? And Renan Barão, I know the guy was a beast, but it's like, who was he beating in his prime? Okay, let's compare TJ Dillashaw to some of these other fighters. Let's compare TJ Dillashaw to Aljamain Sterling, for example. Peter Yan, Henry Cejudo, okay? Corey Sandhagen, also Barão, an older version, but a version coming off of a win. Jimmy Rivera. You also have wins in there like, what's his name? TJ Dillashaw. Now, I don't count Aljamain Sterling's win over TJ Dillashaw. If we're saying that the version of Demetrius Johnson that Dominic Cruz beat wasn't that amazing, it's still a good win that aged well. The Aljamain Sterling win over TJ Dillashaw, a one-armed man, I'm not going to put that on Aljamain's best wins list, okay? But Peter Yan, Henry Cejudo, Corey Sandhagen. I know it was an older version of Cejudo, but Cejudo looked real good in that fight. Renan Barão, the Sandhagen win has aged well. Rivera, that's an insanely good resume. Every single one of those wins is better than Cody Garbrandt. Okay? Now, the real contest is actually Peter Yan and Merab Dvalishvili. So, Aljamain Sterling, I know a lot of people consider him the second best bantamweight of all time. No. All right? His win over TJ Dillashaw, I'm sorry, I just don't look at that as something special. It's not his fault, but I'm not going to give him the credit that is given to a fighter that fought a fighter that was healthy. All right, you have to look at that fight for what it is. TJ Dillashaw had one arm. His arm came out of its socket in the first exchange that they had and was basically defenseless. So we're not just going to say, oh, what a great win over TJ Dillashaw. Let's compare Peter Yan and Aljamain Sterling. Both guys have a win over each other. And I understand that this is going to be an interesting conversation because this is really what fascinates me about the Bantamweight GOAT conversation. I understand that Peter Yan didn't have a win on paper against Aljamain Sterling in their first fight. But before the illegal knee was thrown, the fight lasted, 18, 19 minutes? The illegal knee was thrown about a minute before the end of the fourth round. These guys fought for 19 minutes. I know that the outcome is put down as like a win for Sterling. That is not a fucking win for Aljamain Sterling. I'm not saying you got to count it as a win for Yan, but what I am saying is we saw these guys fight for 19 minutes. We're not just going to forget about what happened, okay? It's not like Peter Yan popped for steroids and the whole performance has to be just completely canceled out. Yan won the first round. He won the third round, dominated it, and was dominating the fourth. Peter Yan was whooping Aljamain Sterling's ass in that fight, especially in the later rounds. 19 minutes of fighting. So when it comes to ranking these fighters all time, I'm really looking at how well they were able to perform. And I can't just look past that fight. I almost look at it as if Peter Yan had a winning performance or a night where he was better than Aljamain Sterling. Okay? So right off the bat, Aljamain Sterling also has a win over Yan. We understand that. But Yan has a win over Corey Sandhagen, just like Aljo. Now, I think Jan's win over Corey Sandhagen is even more special because Corey Sandhagen at that point was a more developed fighter. Aljo beat Sandhagen right before Sandhagen hit his prime. Still a really good version. But Peter Yan beat Corey Sandhagen coming off of a crazy win streak. I think Sandhagen beat TJ Dillashaw. That's why I don't have Sandhagen listed on TJ Dillashaw's list. I'm counting robberies. I know that the judges scored it for Dillashaw, but I saw the fight. I think that Sandhagen should have won that fight. And he was also coming off of 2 KO wins over Marlon Moraes and Frankie Edgar. That's a better version of Corey Sandhagen, and Yan beat that version. Okay? He's got a win over Jose Aldo. And that wasn't just some old washed-up Aldo. That was Aldo coming off of a arguable win over Marlon Moraes. That was Aldo that afterwards, after Peter Yan beat him, went on to win 3 times in a row. 3 wins in a row after that. So Yan beat a top 10 fighter of all time in Jose Aldo. He also beat Song Yadong, which was an incredible win. Song Yadong is a current modern-day top 10 bantamweight that looked good in that fight too, and Peter Yan beat him. That is an amazing win. He beat Jimmy Rivera, who at the time was a good win, and Aljamain Sterling also beat Jimmy Rivera. And you know what? I know that this is controversial, but I think he beat Sean O'Malley. And I understand that, oh, well, even if it was a robbery, you can't say that he beat him. You can't put it on paper. Why not? Like, when we rank these fighters and we rank them, and we're ranking who the best ones are in every single division, why can't I look at Peter Yan's performance over Sean O'Malley and say, actually, I think he won that fight. I'm going to treat that fight as if Yan should have won. That performance was good enough to win. I'm not just going to say that's a loss for him. I know it was a close fight. I think Yan won. It's up for grabs. But guess what? If you think Petr Yan beat Sean O'Malley, how on earth is Aljamain Sterling ahead of Petr Yan? Okay? One guy lost to O'Malley, the other guy beat him. One guy beat Sandhagen. Well, the other guy beat Sandhagen too. One guy beat Song Yadong. Aljamain Sterling doesn't have that win, but he's got a Barao win. And they've both beat each other. And Yan also has a win over Jose Aldo. So what I'm going to say right now is I honestly think Petr Yan has an argument for being the greatest bantamweight of all time, because the only loss he has on his resume is to Aljamain Sterling and Merab Dvalishvili. I think he beat Sean O'Malley. All right, I've seen that fight a bunch of times. I think he beat Sean O'Malley. It was a close fight. He's only really got two convincing losses. Aljamain Sterling in the rematch. Close fight, but I think Aljo won that. And to Merab. He's beat Jose Aldo, who's a top 10 fighter of all time. He's beat Corey Sandhagen, who is 100% a top 10 bantamweight of all time, who is still continuing to beat everyone he fights. He's like, in his own way, a bit of a Max Holloway to Petr Yan. And he's beat Aljamain Sterling. And he's beat Song Yadong. And he's beat the current champion, Sean O'Malley. And he's beat Jimmy Rivera. That's a better resume than fucking Dominic Cruz. All right? It just is. It just is a better resume. Now, the thing that lets Dominic Cruz hold on to that number one spot is the fact that he only has one loss when he was in his prime. Okay? And that was to Cody Garbrandt, which is a horrible loss. It's a terrible loss to have. But outside of that, Cruz only lost when he was an older man to guys like Henry Cejudo coming off of the couch. So it's one of those things where Cruz was consistently winning in his prime. But I don't even know if I can consider him the bantamweight GOAT. Now, I have Merab really high. Why? Because he beat Petr Yan. And I think Petr Yan has an argument for being the bantamweight GOAT. I do. Petr Yan's resume. I know people are going to get upset. What about TJ? Dude, TJ Dillashaw doesn't have a win over Jose Aldo. I think TJ lost to Corey Sandhagen. Okay? He doesn't have a win over Aljamain Sterling. Okay? He doesn't have a win over a guy like Song Yadong. He doesn't have a win over a guy like Sean O'Malley. I think Yan has those wins. And just because 3 judges thought otherwise doesn't mean they're always right. You cannot tell me that the judges, dude, grow up. The judges always get it right. They don't, because it can easily just be disproven by this. One judge can score a fight 48-47. The other can score it 49-46. They can't even agree with each other. They score rounds differently. The judges don't always get it right. They're not always on point. They make mistakes. And some of these robberies, 90% of the MMA fan base agrees. So TJ Dillashaw's resume, I'm sorry, it's not competing with Petr Yan's. It's just not. Now, why is Merab so high? Because I also think he has an argument for being the bantamweight GOAT. Because he's got a dominant win over Petr Yan. Okay? You can give Aljo credit for beating Petr Yan. Why wouldn't you? But who the fuck has 50-45'd him? Okay? Nobody has come close to that. That's basically the equivalent of 50-45ing a guy like Volkanovski. I mean, that's insane. He's also got a win over Aldo. And I know Aldo was a little bit older, but he was riding a crazy win streak. And Aldo was only like 35. It's not like he was a 40-year-old man. And since then, he's come back and he's won. Okay? He's also got a win over Henry Cejudo, who's an older guy. That's the thing about Merab's resume. A couple of these great wins, they're over the older versions of these fighters, but they're still decent versions. Henry Cejudo, he's not in his prime. Aldo, not in his prime when Merab beat them, but still, they look pretty decent. Moraes, he got a win over him, and he's got a lot of quantity too, and he's only got 2 L's. Merab Dvalishvili and his win over Petr Yan kind of carry him in this conversation, but a win over a top 10 all-time fighter like Aldo, very good. But I honestly think it's a toss-up as to who's number one. I have a hard time at this point saying, yeah, Dominic Cruz and his win over Benavidez and Faber a couple times and DJ. I mean, that's incredible, but Peter Yan arguably is the fucking bantamweight GOAT. As crazy as that sounds, man. As crazy as that sounds. I know that some of you guys are going to be saying, if my grandma had wheels, she'd be a bus, because he didn't actually beat Sterling and he didn't actually beat O'Malley. But, dude, look at the way he performed. I don't want to just look at, I'm kind of tired of people just, I don't mean to say, this is actually anti-Anthony Smith. I'm tired of people just looking at the outcome on paper and not actually looking at what happens in the fight. Okay? I think he beat O'Malley. I think he whooped Aljamain Sterling's ass in their first fight, and I'm not just going to forget that. And I'm going to count those performances, okay? And Peter Yan's resume is better than TJ Dillashaw. I think he's one of the most underrated fighters resume-wise of all time. People need to stop rating TJ so high for beating Cody Garbrandt a couple of times and Rafael Assunção and Barao. I know Barao is a beast. Barao's resume doesn't compete with anyone on screen right now. I don't have a number one bantamweight. I don't. I think it's either Cruz, it's Yan. I think if Merab beats O'Malley, I think he's the bantamweight GOAT. I think if Merab beats O'Malley next, he's the bantamweight GOAT. But Merab and Yan are very close. I'll give Cruz the benefit of the doubt right now. Aljamain I have at the 4 spot again. I do think that Yan is a better resume. I think they're 1-1 basically. I think Yan fought a better version of Sandhagen. Yan has a win over a guy like Jose Aldo, and that was a decent version of Aldo, and that win aged well. Aldo since then has won 4 fights. He's got a win over Song Yadong. He's got a win over Rivera. He's got a win over O'Malley. Okay, so let's get on to the next one. We'll get back to real decisive rankings, okay? But just an interesting conversation. Alexander Volkanovski is the featherweight GOAT. Wins over Max Holloway 3 times. That is insane. People still don't understand how important that is or how crazy that is. If Holloway beats Ilia Topuria, the wins that Volk has over Max age incredibly well. Holloway's a top 10 all-time fighter. I believe Holloway only won 3 rounds out of 15 against Volk. So right off the bat, Volkanovski's dominance over a guy like Holloway is crazy. Aldo, who at the time was 32 years old when Volkanovski beat him, riding a 2-fight KO streak, Aldo was. Win streak, not losses, but wins over Jeremy Stephens and Renato Moicano. So a young 32-year-old Jose Aldo, Brian Ortega, Yair Rodriguez, and Chad Mendes. And people think Chad was old, but Chad was actually only 31 years old when Volk beat him. Either way, Volkanovski is the featherweight GOAT. There's just no doubt about it. Max Holloway, number 2. Now, this is where people are going to go crazy. Again, we're only looking at featherweight. We're not looking at bantamweight. I know Aldo has like 5 wins at bantamweight. He's top 10 all-time at bantamweight too, by the way. Jose Aldo is. But we're only looking at featherweight. I just have a hard time putting Jose Aldo over the guy that beat him twice and has a better resume outside of beating Jose Aldo. Aldo's resume is great. It's incredible, but he doesn't have consistent wins like Max in the modern era over guys like Arnold Allen, okay? Calvin Kattar, Yair Rodriguez, Pettis. Like, Max Holloway's resume also includes, of course, beating Jose Aldo twice. That is insane. I know that Aldo beat Edgar, but Holloway beat Edgar that was on a win streak as well. A little bit of an older version of Edgar, but just an insanely good resume. And he's also got quantity, other wins like TKZ, an older version of TKZ. But I think Max is the second best featherweight of all time. I think Aldo, he's still a top 10 GOAT, but part of that is due to the fact that he's won 5 fucking times at bantamweight. Featherweight, Max Holloway's resume is better. And I have Aldo at the 3 spot. He's beat TKZ in his prime. He's beat Chad Mendes twice. He beat Moicano. He beat Edgar twice. He beat Faber. But I just don't think that the resume compares to the guys above him, okay? Volkanovski didn't lose at featherweight until last February. He was undefeated until he fought Ilia Topuria. And he was 35 years old. So it's not like, oh, well, there's been another featherweight that's been able to win at 35 in a championship setting. Never happened. Max Holloway has really only lost to Volkanovski in his prime. Like, that's basically it. And then Jose Aldo, insane resume. But I think that what really brings Aldo to greatness in the top 10, really high up these days, these days is the fact that he's got so many good wins at Bantamweight, which is arguably an even tougher weight class. And the thing is, I understand that Aldo has like 10 fight win streak, 10 title fight win streak. It's not all about title wins, okay? A title win is not the end all be all. Because then you could just say, well, okay, well, what about Volkanovski's win over Aldo? That wasn't for a belt. What about Volkanovski's win over Mendes? That wasn't for a belt. Does it really matter that Max Holloway beat, for example, Arnold Allen for a fight that wasn't for a title? No. But Arnold Allen is a guy that is good enough to contend for a belt. If the champion beats Arnold Allen, you guys are probably, including myself, if you know how good Arnold Allen is, you're going to rate that as a solid title defense. Okay, it's not the best title defense, but a solid title defense. It's not all about title wins. Number 4, Conor McGregor wins over Poirier, Aldo, Mendes, right? He's got like 7 wins in this weight class, and outside of Mendes, Aldo, and Poirier, there's just not a whole lot. Don't get me wrong, the Poirier win was great, but Poirier wasn't even in his prime. And I know you could say, well, Conor was basically the same age. Yeah, but I feel like Conor was peaking at a different time. Either way, still a good win. Poirier was highly ranked at the time. Mendes, great win at the time. But outside of that, we're looking at Seaver. We're looking at Marcus Brimage and shit like that. So, yeah, Conor's at number 4. And Frankie Edgar is at 5. Now, the thing that carries Conor above Frankie is, in my opinion, based on the fact that he's undefeated. All right, McGregor never lost. So right off the bat, the ratio of wins to losses is insane for a guy like Conor McGregor. But I have Frankie Edgar at the number 5 spot. I know Frankie did a lot at lightweight, but he also had a really impressive career at featherweight. I think if Ilia Topuria beats Max Holloway, he's automatically soaring above Conor, in my opinion. Yeah, Frankie's here. He's beaten Chad Mendes. He knocked him out. He beat Charles Oliveira, and I know that was a younger version of Charles, but still a win that has aged well. He beat Yair Rodriguez, who, although wasn't in his prime, Yair was doing well at the time, and it was a great win. He's beaten Cub Swanson, he's beaten Jeremy Stevens, and he beat BJ Penn as well. Now, BJ Penn was out of his prime when Frankie fought him at featherweight, but either way, a good win. So this is my top 5 at featherweight. I've got Volkanovski 1, Max 2, Aldo 3, Conor 4, Frankie 5. People are going to be upset that I have Aldo 3. Resume-wise, Volkanovski has 1 loss in his division when he was 35. That's it. And he's beat Holloway 3 times, and he also beat Aldo. Holloway has beat Aldo twice, and he's also got tons of other amazing wins. Tons of other good wins. And his 3 big losses, I know he's got other losses when he was younger, but his 3 big losses were to one guy. I think Holloway's quantity, the wins that he's racking up these days at featherweight are insanely good, and I think they're better than Aldo's. I think this is a good list. Let's get on to the next one. Lightweight. This is going to surprise some of you, but I think it's time to have this conversation. Just hear me out. I think Islam Makhachev has done enough at this point to be the lightweight GOAT. And I talked about Petr Yan being one of the most underrated fighters ever. I think it's time to start talking about Islam Makhachev's resume as one of the greatest resumes of all time. I don't understand why people aren't talking about him as a top 15, top 10 fighter, but he has to be a top 15, top 10 fighter if you just look at the wins that he has. And I'm going to compare him to the second best lightweight of all time, which is Khabib Nurmagomedov. They're very close. Khabib's undefeated, 13-0. That's an amazing ratio of wins to losses, 100% win rate. But Islam Makhachev's what? 15-1? 16-1? I think he's either 15-1 or 16-1. He's on a 14-fight win streak, or a 15-fight win streak, actually, in the modern era, and his wins are better than Khabib. And it's like, fair enough, Khabib is considered the lightweight GOAT, but Makhachev's only lost once, and his wins are just better. I think it's time. Like, this is the thing. A win over Dustin Poirier is great for Khabib. That's his best win, though. And Islam Makhachev beat Dustin Poirier as well. Yeah, it was a bit of an older Dustin Poirier, but still a good version of Dustin Poirier that was coming off of a win. Dustin Poirier is one of the best lightweights ever. Both guys have beat him. So we can't just say, oh, Khabib beat Poirier. Well, both guys beat him. That's not even the best win that Makhachev has. Makhachev beat Alexander Volkanovski. I know the rematch, Volk was coming off of the couch. He was fat. He was coming off of an arm injury. it is what it is. Still knocked him out and dominated him. That's what you're supposed to do to a guy that's not in great condition. But the first fight, I know it was a close fight, but for Islam Makhachev to go out there and beat Alexander Volkanovski by decision, in part due to the striking, where Volkanovski is known for being the points guy, for being the output striker, the cardio volume striker, for Makhachev to outstrike Volkanovski and beat arguably the best version of Volkanovski we've ever seen, 34 years old, with a 6-month training camp to get up to lightweight, that is a top 5 fighter of all time that Islam Makhachev beat. So right off the bat, he beat a prime version of Alexander Volkanovski, who in his next fight won against Yair Rodriguez, who was undefeated at the time. First guy to ever beat Volk. He beat Dustin Poirier. He beat Charles Oliveira, who was the sitting champion, who was on a 12-fight win streak. This dude beat Oliveira and dominated him in the stand-up. That's a better win than Justin Gaethje. That's a better win than Conor McGregor. And guess what? He's also got a win already over Arman Tsarukyan. And yes, it was a guy that was on short notice and it was Arman's first fight or whatever. But like, that win has aged incredibly well. You could look at that win in a way like, for example, Dominic Cruz beating Demetrius Johnson. And I don't mean resume-wise. I don't mean that Arman Tsarukyan's resume compares to Demetrius Johnson. That's not what I mean. What I mean is it's a win that ages well. Now, I understand that that is not that amazing because, again, it was Arman's first ever fight. But look at what Arman has gone to do since. So that win is a good win. At least it's a good win. He's got a win over Dan Hooker. And you may say, whoa, you're really bringing up a Hooker win? He's got a win over Drew Dober. Whoa, you're really bringing up a Drew Dober win? And he's got a win over Bobby Green. Guess what? Edson Barboza, that doesn't really, in my opinion, stand out that much more than an Arman Tsarukyan win or a Dan Hooker win. A Johnson win, a Michael Johnson win, Dober and Bobby Green are better. And outside of that, Islam Makhachev also has like 7 or 8 other wins in his entire career. That is a lightweight GOAT resume. Volk, top 5 fighter of all time. Charles Oliveira, top 5 lightweight of all time. Arman Tsarukyan, that win has aged amazing. Dustin Poirier, one of the greatest lightweights of all time. Hooker, Dober, Green, not like wins that are going to bring you into the GOAT conversation, but those are good wins. Those are good wins for a Makhachev that is on the come up, on the rise. I think he's done more than Khabib. I think he has. Khabib beat Gaethje, McGregor, Poirier, but we're only looking at lightweight for the most part. I think Makhachev passed him. I think he has. Third pick, Dustin Poirier. People are going to scratch their head and they're going to say, why not Charles Oliveira? In my opinion, even though Dustin Poirier lost to Charles Oliveira, it was one loss. It's not like Charles beat him twice. It's not like Charles beat him 3 or 4 times. It was one loss. And overall, I think Dustin Poirier has a insanely stacked resume that carries him. Okay, we're going to compare it to Charles, who I have at the number 4 spot. Very close. These guys are close. But I think Poirier's resume is a little bit deeper. He's got a win over Justin Gaethje. He's got a win over Max Holloway. And I think that's the thing that kind of brings Poirier above Charles Oliveira, is the fact that he beat Holloway. Fair enough. It was a fat, lightweight version of Holloway. But still, a Max Holloway that was coming off of 3 title wins in a row, that was riding a insane win streak, that hadn't lost in like 5 years, that put up a good fight and still showed a good version of himself. That win has aged insanely well. He's also got a win over Prime Pettis. He's got a win over Eddie Alvarez. He's got a win over Conor McGregor. He's got a win over 2 wins over Conor McGregor, but, you know, the first win, that was still a decent version of McGregor. You know what I mean? That was a McGregor that had only really lost to Khabib and Nate Diaz and was coming off of a win over Cerrone, but you could tell Conor was still focused, and it's not the current drunk version of McGregor that we see today. That win at UFC 264. He's got a win over Dan Hooker in his prime form. He's got a win over Michael Chandler, who is a dangerous guy to fight, who is a great fighter, maybe not a goated win, but still a good win. Benoit Saint-Denis. You can say, okay, that's not a goated win, but it's still a good win. Benoit Saint-Denis, undefeated, had a bunch of good wins in his UFC career, was dominant. That win's probably going to age well. It's basically like beating a Drew Dober. Okay, he's got wins over Bobby Green. Dustin Poirier just has so many insanely good wins. Former champions, McGregor, Alvarez, Holloway. And Charles has beat Dustin Poirier. He's beat Justin Gaethje. He's beat Michael Chandler too. He's beaten Tony Ferguson. and he's beaten Dariush. But outside of that, I really think it takes a steep fall. For example, Charles Oliveira has a win over Jim Miller. Jim Miller's not listed on here because I don't really rate that as that insanely good of a win. Poirier has the same win over a guy like Jim Miller. And Oliveira also has a couple of losses at lightweight too. He's got some losses as well to guys that weren't that great. I mean, fair enough, losing to Paul Felder is not a horrible look, but there are a couple losses that he has at lightweight. All right, just like Poirier, but I just think Poirier's depth of resume is just a little bit crazier. I know that Oliveira hasn't lost to Gage, he hasn't lost to Poirier, and he has those wins, but Poirier also has wins over Holloway, and Poirier has wins over McGregor, and Poirier has wins over, Chandler too, and Eddie Alvarez, and I think that it's very close, but me personally, I think Poirier is a little bit further, because outside of Charles Oliveira's title wins and his win over Chandler, the Ferguson win didn't age well. Fair enough, it was Ferguson coming off of his first loss, but he was like 38 years old. I can't rate that highly. Dariush is good, but like outside of that, it really falls off of a cliff into much lower levels of competition. We're not really going to rate Kevin Lee. I know Lee back in the day was pretty good, and people forget, man, but I'm sorry. Kevin Lee lost to Ally Quinta. Kevin Lee, I don't rate that win that highly. Okay, let's get on to the next one. Tony Ferguson, number 5. Now, I know that some people are going to be saying, what about Benson Henderson? The reason why I actually chose Tony and not Benson is because Benson lost to 3 people that Tony beat. And Tony didn't lose until he was old as fuck. Benson Henderson lost to Pettis, he lost to RDA, and he lost to Cerrone. Ferguson beat those guys. That's kind of why I have Ferguson here, okay? RDA is a great win, especially when Ferguson beat him. It's a great win. I know that I say RDA's got an overrated resume, but it's really because of his welterweight career. But his lightweight career was very solid. Ferguson beat Pettis. We saw that. Insane fight, amazing fight, and a good version of Pettis that Ferguson beat. Ferguson beat RDA. He beat Donald Cerrone on a 3-fight win streak. I know Cerrone was a little bit older, but he was on a 3-fight win streak. He beat Tabao. He beat Edson Barboza, Josh Thompson, who was a solid fighter back in the day. So Tony Ferguson is my pick for the 5th best lightweight of all time. Let's get on to welterweight. George St. Pierre. GSP is always a surprising one because you're expecting sort of like an Anderson Silva resume where it's nothing but old heads that weren't that good. But, dude, Jake Shields had an insanely good resume. Jake Shields was whooping everyone. Okay, so that win is solid. He's also got a win over Carlos Condit, who should have been a champion, should have had a win over Robbie Lawler. He's got 2 wins over Matt Hughes, who was, at the time, one of the GOATs. Okay, Matt Hughes, for a while after GSP beat him, had remained one of the GOATs, and he's still one of the best welterweights of all time. Those wins are great. BJ Penn, I know he's got a bunch of wins over BJ Penn, but he beat decent versions of BJ Penn too. He's got a win over Sean Shirk, who was good at the time. He's got a win over Nick Diaz, who was very good at the time. Frank Trigg as well. GSP's welterweight career was insane. I know he's got a couple of L's. I know he lost to Hendricks. I know he lost to Hughes as well, and I know he lost to Matt Serra, but the quantity that GSP had on his resume was insane. And, the thing is, a lot of the old school fighters, the resume can be good in the moment, but it doesn't age well because the fighters that they're beating didn't really do anything that great in their career. But the people that GSP beat had like insanely good runs, insanely good careers. BJ Penn was a monster. All right, as I said, Jake Shields was very good back in the day. He had tons of wins. All right, Matt Hughes, solid. Carlos Condit, solid. Nick Diaz, solid. All right, so GSP only really lost once in his prime when he was, losing to Hendricks. And Hendricks is on the sauce, so you can kind of look past that a bit, but whatever. On to the next one. Kamaru Usman is still the 2nd best welterweight of all time. All right, very close to GSP, but I think GSP just takes it by a little bit. But Kamaru Usman, let's not forget, he's got a win over the current sitting champion. And people are going to say, well, Leon wasn't in his prime. Well, Usman wasn't in his prime. I know he was a little bit closer to his prime. I know he's a lot older than Leon Edwards, but that's a win that has aged well, obviously. He's got a win over Leon Edwards, okay? Very solid win. That win has aged well. Not the best version of Leon, but he was the one to dethrone Tyron Woodley. all right, and dominated him for 5 rounds. Woodley was on a, 5-fight title win streak, 7-fight win streak in general. Colby Covington, twice. And the Covington wins, I know that Colby doesn't have a crazy resume, but Colby, you could tell just with the eye test, was a very good fighter when Kamaru fought him, especially the first time. That version of Colby Covington was insanely good. All right, and Kamaru beat him, which is very impressive. Gilbert Burns got a good win over Gilbert Burns. 2 wins over Jorge Masvidal, which are pretty good. RDA as well. Damian Maia, question mark, because he was a bit of an old head, and I think that people kind of overrated the older Damian Maia. But either way, Kamaru Usman is the 2nd best welterweight of all time. Leon Edwards is right on his heels at the 3 spot. 2 wins over Usman. Okay? Insane. Knocked Usman out and then schooled him in the trilogy. So he proved that the first one wasn't just a fluke. And that was a championship caliber version of Usman. And since then, Usman has had a fight with Khamzat that he won 2 rounds of. Even if he didn't win, I thought it should have been a draw. And going to a draw with a monster like Khamzat Chimaev is very impressive. So Kamaru is still dangerous. Leon beat him twice. He was on like a 15-fight win streak when Leon beat him the first time. Then he's got a win over Colby, an older version, but still decent win. Win over RDA. The welterweight version of RDA wasn't as good as the lightweight, but either way, it's still decent. Win over Vicente Luque. Nate Diaz, question mark. Are we really going to rate that highly? I don't know. But I guess I can include it. Either way, Leon Edwards, I think if he beats Bilal Muhammad, who's on a crazy win streak, and Bilal's beaten a lot of solid fighters in the modern era, I think that he's like maybe 1 behind Kamaru Usman. I think he needs a couple more, but he's very close because he beat Usman twice. Let's get on to the next one. Tyron Woodley, I got at the 4 spot. I think Leon has passed him at this point. Woodley, I know Woodley didn't lose until he was older, but before he became champion, he had a lot of losses in his career as well. He had like 4 or 5. So I'm not just going to forget about those. But either way, he's got great wins over prime Wonderboy Thompson, Robbie Lawler in his prime, Darren Till. You know, I actually think Darren Till is a very good fighter. Kelvin Gastelum. I know that we're kind of grasping at straws. It was a younger version of Kelvin, but he also beat a good version of Damian Maia and a solid version of Carlos Condit. So I got Woodley at the 4 spot, and I have Matt Hughes at the 5 spot. Best wins over GSP, BJ Penn, Sean Shirk, Frank Trigg. You can make an argument that Matt Hughes is 4. Either way, he has to make the list. A bunch of losses, fair enough, but very good wins. Let's get on to the next one. Middleweight. Anderson Silva, I have him at the 1 spot. Now, the thing that helps Anderson Silva is the ratio of wins to losses that he had when he was at his peak. He had never lost at his peak. He had never lost in his prime. He was always the man in his division. Wins over Vitor Belfort. Vitor Belfort, I was considering putting him on this list. He's not on this list. But Vitor Belfort, he's got a top 10 all-time resume for middleweight. So that's an insanely good win. Dan Henderson, solid win. Dan Henderson is one of the best fighters to never win a belt. Okay, he's got a win over Derek Brunson, who at his, back in the day, Derek Brunson was actually decent. I know he was sloppy, but he was actually a decent fighter. Rich Franklin, Sonnen 2 times. Sonnen back in the day was pretty good. Anderson Silva's got a really good resume, and he didn't lose until he was an old 38-year-old man. It's not like 38 is 38 at featherweight or flyweight. I mean, 38 at middleweight, Alex Pereira is like going to be champ at 38 next year at light heavyweight. You can be champ at 38, but Silva was older. Fair enough. I have Adesanya at number 2, and I have Robert Whittaker right on his heels at number 3. I think their resumes are incredibly close. I know that people are going to roll their eyes, and they're going to say, dude, come on, bro. Adesanya clears. He beat him twice. I honestly think Whittaker beat Israel Adesanya. And again, I understand that the judges gave that fight to Adesanya. I'm just looking at the performance itself. I think Whittaker won 3 rounds out of the 5 in the rematch against Israel Adesanya. And we're going to compare the resumes. But before I compare the resumes, I think that Whittaker and Israel Adesanya are incredibly close to passing Anderson Silva up. I do not think that Anderson Silva's resume, especially because he has a bunch of losses, fair enough, they were when he was older, but still, they're still losses. You still have to count them a little bit. I don't think his resume is strong enough based on strength of competition in order to hold off modern fighters like Whittaker and Adesanya for long. All right, Adesanya has a win over a top 15 fighter of all time in Alex Pereira. Okay, Adesanya has a win over Robert Whittaker. I think Whittaker has a better resume than anyone Silva's beat. I think Alex Pereira has a better resume than anyone Anderson Silva's ever beat. Okay? And I think Cannonier, who Whittaker and Adesanya beat, are better than Chael Sonnen. All right? I think they're better than Brunson. All right? So they're very close. One more win. If Adesanya beats current sitting champion Dricus du Plessis, I don't mind calling him the best middleweight of all time. And if Whittaker then goes out there and beats Sean Strickland, I don't mind calling him the second best middleweight of all time or the best middleweight of all time. So they're very close. But the reason why I have Adesanya ahead of Robert Whittaker is because his win over Whittaker was a little bit more definitive. And he also has that win over Alex Pereira, which is insane. And even though I criticize his performance over Jared Cannonier, he still won that fight. There's no debate about it. And Cannonier is a good fighter, okay? Now, I think that Whittaker is very close to Adesanya. I think he is, because I do think he beat Adesanya in the rematch, okay? They're basically 1-1. But the reason why he's so close and why there's an argument that he's up there is because of his dominance against people like Gastelum, against people like, I don't know, who else are we going to bring up? Marvin Vettori, a common opponent. Because of his win over Yoel Romero, you're probably looking at Adesanya's resume. I think Yoel beat him. Yoel won 3 rounds. I don't count Whittaker's second win over Yoel because I don't think he beat Yoel the second time. I think it was a draw. So I'm not being biased. I'm not just going to say, well, Adesanya didn't beat Yoel, but Whittaker beat him twice. I don't count Whittaker's win over Yoel the second time. I think it was a draw. People are going to say I'm crazy. I think I know how to score fights. I think the judges get it wrong sometimes. But my point is, Whittaker's first win over Yoel Romero was insanely good. He was down 2 rounds to none. And he clutched up and got the next 3 rounds and won the fight. That's an insanely good win. Yoel's one of the best middleweights ever. He's got a win over Adesanya. He's got a win over Jared Cannonier. He got a win over a decent, solid version of Jacare Souza. He dog-walked Kelvin Gastelum. He beat Darren Till. Darren Till's a great fighter. He beat Derek Brunson and knocked his ass out. He beat Paulo Costa. He dominated Marvin Vettori. We recently saw him knock out Ikram Aliskerov. Ikram's a good fighter. Is he on the list? No, because he hasn't proven that he's good enough to make the best wins list yet. But I think that win will age well for Robert Whittaker. I think Ikram will go on to do really good things at middleweight. Maybe not become a champ, but I think he'll become ranked. So it's very close. It's very close. But I have Adesanya ahead a little bit because, again, he did beat Cannonier. And he did beat Gastelum. And he's got a win over Anderson Silva. Okay, and he beat Whittaker, which is insane, and he beat Alex Pereira, which is insane. So, and both guys lost recently, so it's like they're very close. Whittaker lost to DDP. Adesanya lost to Sean Strickland. If Adesanya loses to DDP, I'm going to put Whittaker above him. If Adesanya loses to DDP, I'm putting Whittaker above him. But if Whittaker loses to Strickland next, I'll keep it the same, if that makes sense. Either way, I have Adesanya at 2. I have Whittaker at 3. People were gonna say that, dude, you're just so biased. Dude, I'm just judging them based on performances. The people that have a sober mind when listening to this can see the logic that I'm using. And Anderson Silva is on thin ice because Whittaker, Pereira, Brunson, Cannonier, Gastelum. I mean, dude, Adesanya's wins are so much better than Anderson Silva. I almost kind of cringe a little bit that Silva's still at the 1 spot, but, you know, Vitor was a solid fighter. Belfort was a good fighter. Adesanya lost a couple times in his prime. Whittaker lost a couple times in his prime. Silva didn't, so Silva's still ahead by a little bit. Who's the number 4 best guy? Bro, come on, bro. It's Yoel Romero. Dude, Yoel, look at how wide Yoel is. Yoel is just straight up like twice the width of every single fighter you've ever seen in like these sorts of photos. These like, you know, I don't even know what mugshot photos that the UFC has. I've got Yoel as a top 5 middleweight. And I understand, again, that you guys might not like the way that I rank these things. But listen, I'm not going to be like, I'm a free thinker and I don't need the judges to tell me what to think. I'm not trying to, you know, try to act like I'm super smart and all that. But I count robberies. I think you can tell by now. I count robberies. I look at the performance that a fighter has. I judge it round by round. And that is, for example, why I think Yoel Romero beat Paulo Costa. That is why I think Yoel Romero beat Adesanya. All right? I know he lost to Costa and Adesanya on paper. If you watch the fight with Adesanya, okay, Yoel won 3 rounds. If you watch the fight with Paulo Costa, Yoel won 2 rounds. He won the second round, and he won the third. Straight up. Yoel Romero won 2 rounds off of Paulo Costa. I think he won that fight. I think he has the better argument to win that fight, and he definitely beat Adesanya. Okay? Just rewatch the fight. You cannot give Adesanya 3 rounds. Rockhold, Brunson, Souza, all really solid fighters. Knocked out Luke Rockhold, beat a solid version of Derek Brunson, beat Jacare Souza, beat Chris Weidman. Let's talk about that. This dude knocked out Chris Weidman and sent him to the Shadow Realm. Former champion Weidman, former champion Rockhold, beat Lyoto Machida. We saw that. Brutal finish. So Yoel Romero has an insanely good resume. Has a loss to Robert Whittaker, but also took him to a draw. No shame in losing to Robert Whittaker. Let's get on to the next one. Chris Weidman, I got at the number 5 spot. It was either Weidman or it was going to be Vitor Belfort, or I was also considering putting in, what's his name? Gegard Mousasi. I was thinking of putting in Mousasi as well. I know Mousasi beat Chris Weidman, but I got Weidman in there. He beat Anderson Silva twice. Even though it was an older version of Anderson Silva, that has to count a lot. He beat Vitor Belfort, okay? He beat Lyoto Machida. He beat Michael Bisping. Bisping, I know people are going to say that's not a great win, but Bisping was a good fighter, all right? And he beat Kelvin Gastelum. All right, so Chris Weidman has a solid resume. I think he's the 5th best middleweight ever, but I think Yoel's wins are a little bit better. And I think that Robert Whittaker, his wins are better. Adesanya's wins are better. So this is my top 5 best middleweights of all time, okay? Top 5 best middleweights of all time. Let's get on to the light heavyweight division. Light heavyweight was really difficult for me to rank. I don't know if Alex Pereira should even be on the list, but I also don't think that Shogun should be on the list instead. Like, there are some other fighters where people with nostalgia bias are going to say, what about Shogun? But Shogun's resume ain't even that great. Okay, Alex only has 4 wins. Blachowicz, Prohaska, Hill, all former champions. Prohaska, 4 wins outside of Alex Pereira over solid fighters. Alexander Rakic, Glover Teixeira, Volkanovski, that win has aged well. He's got a win over Dominic Reyes, coming off of the Jan Blachowicz loss, fair enough, but Reyes at the time is still a good win. So Pereira's resume is good. I don't know if it's top 5. He's only got 4 wins. You know, maybe you could put Gustus in there too. Maybe you could put Gus there. Maybe you could put Rumble there. Fair enough if you want to do that. But the thing is, I think, yeah, maybe. Maybe it's a bad choice to put Pereira here. Fair enough. Maybe you could put Gus there. Maybe you could put Rumble there. I've got Glover Teixeira at the 5 spot. But the thing is, Rumble, outside of Glover and outside of Gustafsson, doesn't have that many great wins. Same thing with Gustafsson. Outside of Glover Teixeira and Jan Blachowicz, he doesn't have that many great wins. But either way, I think there's an argument to be made. But my top 3 is very confident. My top 3 is insanely good, I think. Chuck Liddell has amazing wins. And Chuck Liddell didn't lose a lot in his prime. He's got wins over Vitor Belfort. He's got wins over Overeem. He's got wins over Randy Couture. He's got wins over a prime version of Tito Ortiz. I know that Tito Ortiz is a meme, but still, at the time, very good wins. Daniel Cormier, wins over Gustafsson. 2 wins over Rumble Johnson. A win over Volkan Ozdemir. That win has aged well. It has aged really well. And, of course, a win over Henderson. DC's resume at light heavyweight is even better than his resume at heavyweight, in my opinion. I know that he beat Stipe at heavyweight, but outside of that, Derek Lewis, outside of that, not a whole lot. Most of DC's best wins. I know he fought a lot at Strikeforce, but he beat a bunch of cans, a couple of decent fighters, but his resume at light heavyweight's even better than his resume at heavyweight. Insanely good resume that DC has. Jon Jones, of course, no surprise, DC. He beat twice, but we're not going to count one of them because he was popping for steroids. So he beat him once, fair and square. Beat Gustafsson twice, solid wins. Shogun, decent win at the time. I don't think Shogun is top 5. I'm sorry. I don't think Shogun has a top 5 resume. Beat Vitor Belfort. Beat Santos. All right, Santos is a solid win, even though it was a close fight. He still beat him. He beat Lyoto Machida, and he beat Rampage Jackson. He beat Ryan Bader. I mean, Jones, just based on quantity, is obviously the light heavyweight GOAT. Let's get on to heavyweight. I think Fabricio Verdum arguably has a better resume than Fedor Emelianenko. I got Stipe at 1. He has wins over Francis Ngannou, and Stipe's win over Francis Ngannou aged insanely well. Ngannou was on a crazy win streak at the time as well, and then afterwards went on a crazy win streak. Stipe beat a really dangerous version of Francis Ngannou, and he was not even expected to win that fight. He beat DC twice. DC was an older man. I understand that, but DC was the sitting champion at the time. Not only a sitting champion, a sitting double champion that had defended his belt. Still a good version of DC. Third time, it was an older DC, but you know how these guys are at heavyweight. You can win a belt, you can win title fights when you're older. Look at Blachowicz at light heavyweight, 38-year-old Blachowicz. Look at Glover. Glover was a champ at 40. So people can do well at their older age, but the second win over DC, it's not going to be ranked as like, you know, a top 10 all-time win or something like that. But either way, wins over DC. DC is a top 10 all-time fighter. The first win over DC was incredible. Even though he was losing, he came back, clutched up, body shot TKO'd him. Not with just body shots, but the body shot started it off. He's got a win over Verdum in a championship setting, which is insane. Okay, he's got a win over Junior Dos Santos. I know he lost to JDS, but he's also got a win over him, and a good version too. A win over Overeem. A win over Andrei Arlovski, and it was a younger version of Andrei Arlovski. Not a young version, but a younger version than the one that we know today. So Stipe is obviously the heavyweight GOAT. All right, beating Verdum is insane. JDS, great win. Overeem, great win. Ngannou, insane win. DC twice, crazy. Fabricio Verdum I have over Fedor. I know Fedor had an insane streak. I know that Big Nog back in the day was, you know, Big Nog was not just a guy from the Salty Spittoon. Big Nog was feared. Arlovski, at the time, was really good. And at the time, you know, went on to do great things and became a UFC champ. Mark Coleman, great. But outside of that, I just don't think Fedor's resume is that great. It's a ton of quantity. It's a ton of quantity. But Verdum beat Fedor, and it wasn't an old head version of Fedor. Fedor got knocked out 3 times in a row before he was 35. And we're talking heavyweight, where you can be champ when you're 40, 41. I think that getting knocked out when you're 35 is that's not an excuse you can make. You can't be like, oh, well, you're 35. Like, Aldo at 35 was winning at Bantamweight. You know what I mean? This is heavyweight. Verdum beat him, and it was a decent version of Fedor. I think he ran into really sick competition. I know he wasn't maybe at his peak, but still was a good version of himself. But look at Verdum's, I know I keep pronouncing it with a V. Look at Verdum's resume. Cain Velasquez, insanely good win. Fedor, amazing win. Big Nog, he's got a Big Nog win too, which is really good. Overeem, great win. I mean, Verdum has a lot of good wins. And then I have Francis at number 4. Got a win over Miocic, which was a solid win at the time. Stipe was a champion, had defended a couple of times, had, you know, even though he lost to DC before that, had defended 3 times. So Stipe, he took out the heavyweight GOAT. That's amazing. He beat Overeem. Amazing win. He beat Blades twice. Great wins. JDS was a little bit older. Rosenstrike. Solid. Outside of that, Francis Ngannou's wins over like Cain Velasquez, I'm not counting it. Cain Velasquez was a deflated balloon. But Francis is in the conversation, I think. He's definitely in the conversation. Got a really good resume. He's only lost a couple times. He's only lost once, really, to be honest. He didn't really lose to Derek Lewis. But either way, Cain Velasquez, I got at the 5 spot. JDS twice. Big Nog. Brock Lesnar. Antonio Silva. I think it's very close. I think Stipe has to be the heavyweight GOAT, but I honestly think Verdum has a better resume than Fedor. Either way, Fedor's on the list too. Fedor Emelianenko. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed. I know that the picks aren't perfect, but I did my best to rank these guys. These are my lists. This is the heavyweight list. This is the light heavyweight list, the middleweight list, the welterweight list, the lightweight list. And of course, we have the featherweight list, the bantamweight list. Anyway, you guys get my point. That is the video. Hope you guys enjoyed. Until next time.